Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Negotiation. I am your host, Todd Embley, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Simon Torring, co founder of Cube Asia, a market insights company for online retail in Southeast Asia. Simon is an expert in the Southeast Asian retail space, especially in the cosmetics and luxury sectors. Before founding Cube Asia, Simon held various regional leadership roles at Sephora related to e-commerce and marketing, and currently serves as external advisor to McKinsey. Simon, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Todd. Thanks so much for having me. Excited
All
to
right.
to join the podcast.
All right. Great to have you. Now, as we always ask, where are you in the world today that we are recording you from?
So I am at my home in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and I don't spend too much time here. But this week I'm back home, and it feels great.
That's nice. I'm going to call it KL from this
hmm
point forward because Kuala Lumpur sometimes it trips me up. So I'm going to go with KL for those of you listening. You spent much of your career paths in parts of Southeast Asia, including KL, Singapore, Jakarta, Bangkok.
hmm
What brought you? What's the backstory to how you ended up in that part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say there was some big a master plan to it, but it was really a coincidence. I was just out of high school. I'd sold my little business. I was looking for the next thing, and I was enrolled in actually in economics to study economics back in Denmark. And then I got an offer through LinkedIn to come and join a venture builder in Malaysia, of all places, as an intern. That was supposed to be 6 months, and turned out to be, well, now 10, 11 years. Haven't really made it back. So that was the start. And then everything just took, step by step,
Yes.
serendipitously since then. Yeah.
I'm familiar. You and I were chatting offline a little bit about how nobody ends up in Asia on purpose if they're not from there. It's remarkable. And even if, just on the streets doing business everywhere we go, we talk to so many people that are living and working and raising kids there. And how did you end up here? And there was no master plan. You just ended up there. And I just love that now in the day and age that we live, you can just end up pretty much anywhere in the world and make it go and love it. And I'm sure
Mm.
you're loving it everywhere in Southeast Asia, especially KL. I've never actually been there. I've been through the airport, but I've never been
hmm
there. But I just the pictures of all my friends that are there, it seems amazing to be there.
Yeah.
So I want to start with talking about your work at Luxola,
hmm
online beauty retailer in APAC, and then it was acquired by Sephora. Tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about how you went through that, what you were doing, and what it was like to go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Luxola was a kind of a multi-brand e-commerce for beauty products, started by an American entrepreneur in Singapore back in, I think, late 2011. And I joined the business at the end of 2013 after my time during that internship in KL. And I didn't know anything about the beauty space. I knew a little bit about e-commerce, but nothing about beauty. Um, and it was just a wonderful time to build that business. And what that business really was, in my view, was an arbitrage on um, what beauty products were available domestically in the markets versus what products were consumers really longing to buy and to try. Because one sort of very common behavior set back then that I didn't know about was that people from most Southeast Asian countries, if they went to Europe or the US or Australia or whatever, they would bring an extra suitcase, or at least save extra space in their suitcase to bring back products for themselves and their friends and their family of brands that were just not available in the markets. And what Luxola was exploiting well was to go to those brands, and they were not your L'Oreal's and Estee Lauders. They were sort of the next set of indie brands and upcoming brands from the US or from Canada or Australia or Europe or whatever. So Luxola went to them and basically said, there's this thing called Southeast Asia. It's a big mess for you to go there on your own because you'll need to comply with FDA requirements in each individual country. But if you go with us, we can just import into Singapore, and then we can drop ship into every country in Southeast Asia due to some regulation. And that meant suddenly we were bringing to market these brands that had not really been available to consumers freely before, and that turned out to work really well. So that was the start of it, and then obviously it just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and became really the backbone of Sephora's e-commerce in Southeast Asia.
Okay. Now you're at Sephora. E-commerce starts to boom. How are you navigating that tremendous growth in e-commerce yourself, the work that you do, and for Sephora?
Yeah, in a sense, we didn't know it at the time, right? But it was, 2012 to 14, I think, was really when the party got going. I think a lot of the fire was stoked by Rocket Internet's investments in the region. So they started things like Lazada, which is now very big, Zalora, many other e-commerce kind of copycat business models from the West. They started them and rolled them out across the region. For me, it was it was a super exciting time. I thought that we at Sephora were right at the center of it all, because the business was doing really well. Certainly supported by a very innovative and forward-looking leadership. Like there were leaders in that business that really saw that trend and wanted to invest heavily in it. That has turned out to be a great call now. But I think what's interesting is for us, it looked like we were right at the center of it, but we were in a sense in the periphery, because I would say 80-90% of the growth came from the mass market, and Sephora didn't see that. But it was just being in the periphery, just having exposure to the prestige market and sort of the upper end of the mass market was plenty. So it was only later, when I had a chance to step a bit away from Sephora and look at e-commerce as a whole, which is kind of what I do now, that I saw, wow, prestige is like, a few percent of a few percent, right? And it looked big to us, but then there's so much more out there.
Okay. Give us a bit of a breakdown en masse of the entire cosmetics sector in Southeast Asia. Maybe talk about what are the most successful brands, and then maybe let's cap that off with how important online retail is for the beauty sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think the percentage of mass, and then I think a very typical beauty industry term is masstige, which is kind of like when you can't decide if you're up or down. That's in the middle, and then prestige. That split differs greatly by country. But the markets across Southeast Asia are still predominantly mass. There are some that have a little bit higher exposure to prestige than you would guess from looking at their GDP. So, for example, Thailand has just a bigger prestige market than they should have on paper for various reasons. But in general, it is predominantly a mass market. I don't know if this is still the case, but I remember a couple of years ago, probably 2018-19, I remember seeing a figure that the prestige beauty market of Australia, which has 22, 23 million population, is bigger than that of Southeast Asia combined. Just to put things into perspective, right? So it's still predominantly mass. Inside of that market, there is a massive disruption going on at the moment. The first chapter of beauty e-commerce in Southeast Asia was really mostly foreign brands. So your L'Oreal's, Estee Lauder, Shiseido, Amore Pacific, and so on, like big corporate groups that hold several brands. They went in first and did well. And then what we started to see was more and more emergence of local brands. And those local brands in the beginning were generally quite bad. Everything from branding to formulations, packaging, marketing, they were kind of learning from scratch. So not a huge threat. And like if you went and met one of these big brand groups back then, they wouldn't even really care about this local competition. Now that has changed a lot. So there is the emergence of very strong local brands in markets like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines. If we look at what are the biggest brands right now, that many of them are local. And then there's also the emergence of what is typically called cross-border brands. So these are also foreign, but they are more typically from Asia than they are from the West.
Mm,
Most of them are from China. Some of them are openly Chinese. Others are a little bit more using, let's call it, international branding, but are super present. And those brands are, for instance, you'd find several of them in the top 5 of beauty brands in Indonesia, for instance.
wow. Wow.
So that's really changed a lot.
Okay. And just generally the importance of
Yeah.
online retail for the beauty sector.
Yeah, well, it is very important. Beauty is one of the categories in Southeast Asia e-commerce that has the highest penetration. Highest penetration to e-commerce. It doesn't mean that beauty is the largest e-commerce category. It just means that
Right.
the biggest proportion of total beauty spending is online. So it's not uncommon to see brands having 30, 40, 50% e-commerce contribution now. E-commerce is also where this new generation of challenger brands and local insurgent brands have, in a sense, been born. They are now moving into more omni-channel distribution, drugstores, own boutiques, things like that. But they were born online. That's what they know best, and so they are very, very good at that. And now with the emergence of new channels like TikTok Shop, which is will be the most important story for beauty e-commerce in the next year or two, um, they're leapfrogging further because the large brand groups are having a very hard time really getting the commercial strategy for that channel completely right.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I can see where the big brands are coming from. There's a difference between somebody who speaks a language fluently and then there's somebody who speaks it natively, right?
Yeah.
The bigger, more established, they might end up being able to speak e-commerce fluently. But the challengers, they speak it natively. This
Yeah.
is where they were born.
Yeah.
And this is where they are probably offline retail, I don't know, semi-fluent. But they were built, and that's the benefit of the platforms. You get the data, you can test, you could trial, you can A/B test, you could do all kinds of things,
Mm.
and you can learn and grow so quickly. You can be so competitive so fast simply because of the ability to pivot and iterate so quickly. Just such a low
Mm.
investment to learn so much. So definitely threatening. I'm curious. I mean, would you maybe attribute that penetration of e-commerce or online retail for the beauty sector to just like, let's say, price points?
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
Logistically, we're smaller packages, I'm assuming. Trust in people being able to purchase something online versus something they need to touch or feel or something else. I mean, where is the attribution, do you think,
Mm.
for the beauty sector to be so successful in online retail?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it's a combination of factors, but it certainly includes. So the price points are nice. They're not. It's not like buying an iPhone, where it's thousands of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the worries about being conned or scammed are there, but are not a a deal breaker. It's also a category where most purchases are branded. So versus fashion or something like that, where it's just you have branded goods, you have unbranded goods too. In beauty, most of the stuff is branded, which means there's also a lot of replenishment missions and there's a lot of shopping missions where you are frankly just looking to buy what someone has recommended to you, whether it is a friend or an influencer. So it is a category that lends itself really well to search. And I think in that sense, e-commerce is quite nice because if you can find what you're looking for and you trust the seller and the platform where you're buying it from, all right, why not try? So I think it's that, and then it happens to be that the brand formation. Um, uh, there's been a lot of new challenger brands coming onto the scene, um, And for whatever reason, they have found that it made most sense for them to start online. Um, if I had to guess, I think it's because online you are not you're not so beholden to your distribution partners. Typically in beauty, when you start a brand and you find a bit of growth, it is a bit of a deal with the devil when you go and speak to Watsons or Guardian or Sephora or whoever it is, who say, we will propel your sales, but we will also take a good chunk in margin, right? And you're gonna play by our rules, and you're
It's
gonna have
Costco.
very onerous returns clauses and stuff like that. So I can imagine for these entrepreneurs that have started brands, they've gone, why would I want to give, I don't know, a lot of percent to a distribution partner if I can just go and sell on Shopee or Lazada?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I'm I just think of this data point that I'm like interested to find out on repeat business. I mean, if you're
Mm.
textiles, you don't really find a shirt you like and then buy that same shirt
Mm.
for 5 years in a row.
Mm.
Whereas I'll be honest, I've been wearing Chanel Bleu for
Mm. Mm-hmm.
a decade. I just
Mm-hmm.
love it. Other people seem to like it. I don't have time to go
Mm-hmm.
sniffing for a few hours and coffee bean and then the next one and coffee. So I just and then I know what I want. I know the shade, the color, the whatever. So and it's just easier to do it online then, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's one of the things that the leadership of Sephora saw early on, um, where I was so lucky to be at the right place at the right time to lead omnichannel for Sephora in Southeast Asia for a few years. But the vision came from my leaders, right? And it was just very clear that they really understood that beauty is a combination of so many different shopping missions, and for some of them you want it to be a candy store, which the physical stores are very good for,
Mm-hmm.
super discovery focused. Then for others, what you want is to make replenishment very simple, or to make comparison of products very simple. And e-commerce just lends itself really well to that. And I still think to this day that Sephora has done a really good job at articulating that omni-channel customer engagement mode, where
Yeah.
I think we used to call it browse, buy, ask, exchange where you want. That was the that was the that was the label.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many things that I even want to like returns and the impact on returns and the different verticals or sectors and But anyway, but we're not going to do that. We're going to move on. I want to get to the platforms, the e-commerce
Mm-hmm.
platforms. So, we've dallied in talking about the platforms out there, but give us from your point of view, talk about the growth of e-commerce in the region
Yeah.
and call out the biggest, best largest e-commerce platforms in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Okay. So I at a high level, um, from let's call it 2013-14 and up until last year, e-commerce was growing in Southeast Asia at a compounded annual growth rate of about 60%. Over the COVID years, it then went all the way up to 100%.
Wow.
And that was the gold rush, right? So brands, established brands, basically just had to, one, decide that they were okay to do e-commerce, and then two, put their products on one of the large platforms that were driving most of the growth. So this was first Lazada as the first sort of real regional player. Then it became Shopee, which was around 2015-16, which became another big regional player. Then there has been the emergence of big players in some of the individual countries, like Tokopedia in Indonesia, for instance. And then more recently, like in the last 6-9 months, that's when we've started to see TikTok Shop as well. I'll come back to that, but just to complete the point on 60% compounded annual growth up until around last year. Then from this year onwards, it's a very different picture. So if we look at what we foresee being the growth path for the next 5-6 years, it's more going to be somewhere between 15 and 20%. So in a way, per year. So the those 60%, 80% growth years we believe are over. E-commerce has just become so big now that it's no longer sort of growing into its natural size. Now it will be a different game. That has huge implications for how brands think about e-commerce and think about their P&L. But we believe basically that we're starting kind of we have started the second era, in a sense, of more steady growth. Now back to the channel landscape. So who are the big players? It is indeed Lazada, Shopee, and now increasingly TikTok Shop as kind of the third horseman across the region. I said Lazada first and Shopee second. Shopee is the bigger one. So you could say Shopee number one, Lazada number two, and then increasingly TikTok Shop as a number three, particularly in beauty and fashion, where they have the biggest exposure. After that, there are some like single market players. There are bits and pieces of other specialized e-commerce. But if you're new to the region and bringing a new product to market, there's really no reason to spend a single minute outside of those three platforms. Like, just you could spend the next 5 years getting them right, and then worry about the rest afterwards. That's really where the party is at.
Okay. I have a question I want to ask around knowing from my background of China that one thing that China did really well was they gave a lot of opportunity to local tech and innovation and platforms and whatnot. They knew that they were probably a little bit behind. So they bought time for locally grown to grow. They didn't just let Google and Facebook and Microsoft and the likes walk in and suck all the oxygen out of the room. They said you can exist, but you cannot flourish. We will allow you to have presence, but we are going to preserve the sheer GDP of what's going to come for locally grown, but we're going to have to give them time to catch up. And I thought that was fair. I really did. What do you think is happening in that region in that regard? Do you find that countries are following a similar pattern, or have Amazon and the likes just not been able to penetrate for other reasons?
Yeah, excellent question. As a whole, I think there are a couple of elements to cover to give a fair answer to that question. The first is, let's look at how friendly and open the different markets in the region are to foreign players. The only one that is really taking a stand is Indonesia. Indonesia is the biggest country in the region, and they are really starting to behave like that. Foreign majority ownership of companies generally not possible. You kind of have to play by their rules, partner with local businesses. For e-commerce, one interesting tidbit is you have these de minimis rules for consumer imports. So if I in Malaysia am buying something from a US e-commerce site or a Japanese e-commerce site, there tends to be in this instance in Malaysia, it's about $100. If I buy something that's less than that, I don't generally have to worry about duties, taxes, handling, whatever. It just sort of flies under. Across Southeast Asia, that de minimis level is generally between 80 and $120. In Indonesia, it's $2. They've brought it down from, I think, 100, then to like 50, then to 10, and then down to 2. They really do not want you as a consumer to be doing e-commerce that is drop shipped from somewhere else. They want that to stay in the country, right? So a bit more sort of closed posture. At the same time, I think there are certainly there's a lot of that kind of ambiguity, maybe sort of on purpose in the market. I think famously, Google, to my knowledge, still does not have an office in Vietnam, for instance. Google are selling lots of ads in Vietnam. How do they then do that? Well, maybe you're served by salespeople in different countries nearby. Maybe they happen to fly in often. So there's still a lot of that. But I would say in general, Southeast Asia is certainly much more open. And when you look at the big players right now in e-commerce, so Shopee, which is a subsidiary of a listed company, C, that is listed out of Singapore, I suppose is a Singaporean company, but with a global shareholder base. Lazada is part of the Alibaba group. TikTok Shop is clearly part of the TikTok ecosystem, ByteDance ecosystem. So far, there are these real pure play local players, but none of them have really won. Tokopedia in Indonesia was a serious contender, and in some categories is still bigger than Shopee there. They merged with a local transportation player called Gojek to form kind of a mega super app company, Go2, that doesn't seem to be working really well for them. So I think although the local although the local system might be trying to hold a hand under them, if we just look at market share, these, I would call them regional global players, Shopee, Lazada, and TikTok Shop, are still doing fine everywhere.
Okay. I want to thank you for taking that on. In full disclosure, these are just our opinions. This is just your opinion. There's no fact, maybe, put down the warrior keyboard stuff if you're coming after us for some of these things, or you disagree. Hey, these are just opinions. And, if it inspires you to think more deeply, or you have a different opinion, then by all means, let us have it. We'd love to hear from you in the comments, or even email us at podcast@wpic.co. But moving on, we've talked about Lazada and Shopee quite a bit. Can you, in your opinion, just quickly, maybe a minute or two, break down just what the differences between the two are?
Yeah. I think it won't even take a minute. The positioning of Lazada has generally been slightly higher than the position of Shopee. Shopee wanted everyone to buy anything, domestic, cross-border, whatever. And for that reason, Shopee has the biggest reach and has the largest consumer base. What is, though, happening, especially in the last 6 to 9 months, is that Lazada, the way that they did two things to get that, let's say, higher positioning. One, they were much more intentional around partnering closely with brands that have higher market assortment. They knew and understood what those brands needed. They needed close partnership, account management, assurance that your products are not going to show up next to fake products, that kind of stuff. So they were good at that, which Shopee just didn't really worry too much about on it during their rise. The other thing was that Lazada generally did not endorse or support the very bottom of the categories. So in beauty, for example, the very cheap cross-border brands, Lazada was perhaps tolerating them but never really promoting them. That has changed in the last, certainly in the last year. And so from where I sit, what it looks like is basically Shopee and Lazada are becoming more and more the same. To a point now where I wouldn't really worry too much about differentiating my go-to-market strategies on the two. They are starting to look more and more homogenous to me.
Okay. Maybe not a fair question, but are there differences in vertical, let's call it ownership? Is one the king of of a vertical, whereas, the other has a king in something else? And I'm always interested because how you look at success can change. You can look at activity. You can look at cart size. You can just look at revenues or actual profitability. And that changes on when you're at the low end, high volume, but you may have low revenues. But then you may have high profitability. So can you talk about the difference between them down there in those regards?
Yeah, it's not too different, to be honest. And there's also variance between the markets. We cannot see Lazada's profitability because it's so kind of wrapped into the whole Alibaba holding structure.
Yeah. They're not a
Shopee
pub.
famously
Yeah.
has become a little bit profitable in Q1. It will now be very interesting to see how that develops in the next coming quarters because of the threat of TikTok Shop. That will maybe not allow them to carry on being so prudent
Mm.
financially. So I think we will kind of see what shakes out when the next sets of quarterly results are reported. But no, they are not that different. I would say in some individual markets they do have more ownership of a certain category, but no, I think as a whole they are more similar than they are different. And I think it's a big misperception in the market. There's a lot of the brands that we work with would say, Lazada, there's one shopper, and then Shopee is a very different shopper, and so I need very different strategies. And we're like, well, eight of 10 customers overlap between the two, so like, how different is it really?
Interesting. Okay. Um, Maybe a last question on those two before we start talking a little bit deeper about TikTok. Just generally speaking, that e-commerce ecosystem. What is it fair to ask you to compare, given that you're so knowledgeable about Southeast Asia, and I don't want to assume that you know as much about what happens in the West, but could I ask for a bit of a comparison from Southeast
Hmm.
Asia to maybe the US to maybe China, just on UI, UX,
Yeah.
interface, brand strategy, delivery times, penetration, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Um, Southeast Asia is much more aligned to China.
Okay.
Um, so I think actually China is an excellent reference point. Um, Lazada got its UI from Tmall. Shopee has a lot of the same. TikTok Shop is a complete, more or less complete duplication or clone of the e-commerce parts of Douyin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that's where we look to. Comparisons to the West, I think it's more different than it is the same. So, for example, just the presence of brand.com, the presence of large kind of single category e-commerce destinations, something like Zalando or ASOS, uh, it's just not huge. It is really a game of Shopee, Lazada, and TikTok Shop, and then these local contenders. And for me, it feels much more similar to China.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, and I told you before, and listeners know have been listening, I have a background in UPS, so I'm a bit of a logistics fanboy. So, yes, China and the US are fascinating to me. But they are gifted. They have population distribution plus geography uh, parameters and perimeters that are just almost unfair to compare others to. You can't compare even in the logistical realm, which impacts everything else. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
You can't like Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, I mean, they don't get to compare to anybody because it's crazy different over there. Boats and planes and planes, trains, and automobiles. All the time there.
Yes.
So we don't need to comment on that, but it is definitely worth reminding everybody that there is a severe unfair advantage with population distribution and just almost this rectangle of or circular rectangle, if that's such a thing, of the way China and the US are built. So okay, we'll move on from that. Okay. Financial Times story. You were quoted on the emergence of TikTok as an e-commerce player in Southeast Asia. Obviously, TikTok Shop. What moves is TikTok making in the region? And is it a legitimate challenger, which we already know that it is. But talk about more in depth what TikTok is doing.
Yeah. Um, it's really quite fascinating. So there, at the regional level, again, at single country, there is more nuance, but at the regional level, it has really been a game of Shopee versus Lazada the last like 5 years. There hasn't been a serious third player up until
Mm.
now. So TikTok has obviously been huge in the region for a couple of years as an entertainment or social content platform. And then at the beginning of 2022, they started slowly launching e-commerce features, first in Indonesia and then in the other countries. And I think there was not a lot of attention paid to it in the beginning. Like I was working with my co-founder full time on e-commerce, market data and research all the way back to the beginning of 2022, and we didn't even start to think about or see TikTok for real, until well into the summer. But then something like we just started to see it in the numbers, like particularly in beauty and fashion, just a very rapid rise of sales, the emergence of a new set of winning brands. So brands making, in some instances, tens of millions of dollars annualized sales, right, on this platform that were not really super famous from the platforms that we had seen before. So they might be like ranked 36 in fragrance on Shopee, and then on TikTok they're number one or number two, right? So like, this is interesting. And then I think crucially what we saw was the first thing TikTok did was just sort of obvious, which was to integrate payment into the social experience. And that's something where Meta or Facebook, Instagram, that whole ecosystem had really been fumbling the ball in an almost unimaginable degree. Like they've been talking about doing this for like 5 years, and it's all stayed with some small pilot programs. Like it's incredible that they didn't manage to do it. So TikTok just came and did that. And so I think a certain share of the market shifted just because now consumers could very easily pay after looking at a live stream or watching a piece of content or something like that. But then, very interestingly, we started to see TikTok really behaving like an e-commerce company, building huge account management teams, co-funding marketing activities with the brands, paying for free shipping subsidies, hosting double-day mega campaigns. And we were like, wait a second, we haven't seen this kind of player before that is starting from the social part of social commerce and then really taking the commerce part seriously as well. And I think that combination has turned out to be lethal, and to work really, really well. So across Southeast Asia, we believe the GMV for last year, the sales for last year was over $4 billion, about 2.5 of that coming from Indonesia, so a pretty significant volume already. That entire 2022 volume, we believe, was exceeded in the first quarter of this year. So it's growing very, very fast. And I think for this year, across Southeast Asia, I wouldn't be surprised if TikTok Shop ends up doing somewhere between 13 and 18 billion US dollars of trade. So it's just become a massive force very quickly in categories like fashion and beauty. It has taken share from Shopee. It has taken share from Lazada. And it's really shaking up that whole marketplace, which is fascinating and very good for brands and very good for consumers.
Is this so? I'm interested to ask further about this from the fact that Lazada and Shopee are mostly platforms, but TikTok has the influencers. And having that kind of, ammunition coming into the game here gives you a lot of advantages. And I'm wondering also if that either restricts the verticals that you can really grow in fast, although it gives you a super unfair advantage to really grow fast in verticals where influencers are so important.
Yeah. Actually, for that Financial Times piece, I think one of the interesting topics that we discussed was what can go wrong. Because right now, and I'm also hyping up TikTok Shop. I mean, you can hear that, but I think it has to be a balanced discussion. And a lot of these amazing growth rates or projections that we have kind of assume that nothing will go wrong. And I don't know about you, but I've never tried being in a business where nothing goes wrong. And so some of the things that we need to see in order to make sense of these large forecasts is indeed, for example, TikTok Shop needs to prove that it can generate significant volume outside of beauty and fashion. Beauty and fashion is like 75% of the volume on the platform now. And those
Yeah.
categories, they lend themselves very well to be sold in a live stream or a content adjacent setting, right? And that is indeed where the influencers are, and where TikTok is benefiting so much from the fact that people are opening up the app. They don't need to be paid to open up the app, right? Like, or that there's no need for an ad to drive people
Mm.
to open the app. They do that by themselves for several hours a day. So I think that is a big question mark. We are starting to see some inklings of FMCG, home and office categories also doing well. For instance, in Indonesia, you can sell a lot of toothpaste on TikTok Shop in Indonesia, for example, or electric toothbrushes. But it's not yet a given, and it could very well turn out that they're going to have a much harder time in those other categories. And those other categories are so important to get to the next level of growth, because you just cannot get to those high GMV figures of Shopee and Lazada if you don't have a good electronics category, if you don't have a good sort of large white goods category. And there's barely any of that so far.
Mm.
You'd not buy a Samsung smartphone on TikTok Shop right now. There's probably like 4 people who've done it, so they've used it in an example for slide deck somewhere, but that's not the norm. And I think I don't know if they can, but I know that it will be much harder for them to do that than it was to conquer beauty and fashion.
Okay. One more question before we talk about Cube Asia. Have any of the platforms done? Maybe they've already done it and done it very well, but I'm not sure because I haven't seen it yet. And that could just be me not seeing it. But going the route of Amazon Basics, where you see everything, you
Yeah,
see what's being searched, you see what's already on your platform, you see what the prices are, you know what you could probably get your hands on manufacturing it for and brand it yourself. And yes, I don't think anybody who's had an Amazon, like any brand or product that's had an Amazon Basics come out against them is very happy about it. But have you seen any of the platforms there running that model out?
yeah. That's I love that question. The short answer is no. So both Lazada and Shopee have not done so.
Hmm.
Um, but TikTok seems to be starting now.
Hmm.
And they have now. I'm forgetting. They have like a code name for this project, which is about being, their own brand group too, and sourcing products. Uh, uh, and I think that's another potential threat to TikTok's rise, is that for all of their complexities, both Shopee and Lazada have basically grown with a very merchant friendly model. They are true marketplaces. They are
Yeah.
not really interested in being retailers, at least so far. Uh, TikTok seems to be jumping 7 steps ahead and doing that already. And I it might turn out to be very successful for them, but that will certainly be that will be something new. That's not something that we have seen before. So
Yeah.
no, the Amazon Basics comp we don't have in a significant way in Southeast Asia yet.
Yeah. Because if TikTok does something to piss off their core,
Yeah.
which is a different core than what Lazada and Shopee have, they
Mm.
have to maintain that. They have to take care of a completely different audience, and they've got their customers and their clients, right? They have their audience and their content makers,
Yeah.
and they definitely can't take their eye off the ball with regards to making them happy, which is just very, very different than Lazada and Shopee being able to be kind of locked in, focused on those that bring them revenue. So,
Yeah.
um,
And so my personal opinion is that they ought to take good care of the existing merchant base first, because as an ex retailer myself, you want a well-rounded assortment, right? And I think doing Amazon basics before you have those brands that you are then copying is a bit tough, right? Like you want a destination where people can choose, where they can see the Duracell batteries and they can see the Amazon basics batteries, and they can decide for themselves. But
Mm-hmm.
if Duracell is not there, yeah, like it just seems to me like it's skipping a few steps ahead, in a sense. But it's, I think so far it's a rumor, it's a pilot project, so perhaps it's a small thing and they will actually come back and do it in earnest in a few years. So maybe it's just fine.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to really piss off brands and products
Mm.
from allowing themselves to be present. But then I also do know that at the end of the day, the only color that matters is green. And if they're, if they're still making, money by being there, then so be it. As much as they maybe don't like it. So, okay, so let's move on to CubeAsia. You are the co-founder of CubeAsia, a market insights company. Tell us a little bit about CubeAsia, how it was formed, what your thesis and what your vision is, with you and your co-founders. I don't know how many there are.
Co-founder, yeah,
Yeah,
there's one.
co-founder.
Mm.
And then tell us about CubeAsia in that way,
Mm-hmm.
and then start talking to us about what you're seeing, hottest consumer sectors in the region. It's a bit of a
Yeah.
softball question for you, but yeah, tell us what you do and what you're seeing.
No, of course. So yeah, I've spent the last 10 years in and around e-commerce in Southeast Asia, and after leaving Sephora, I'm still good friends with Sephora. I had wonderful time there, and it's great people. After I left, I wanted to start a startup, and through a windy path, I ended up in consulting, and I met there my now co-founder Sarab, who's an absolute genius, and he and I bonded over a problem, which is e-commerce has gotten so big in Southeast Asia. Why is there no good market data? um, Offline retail, best practices, you will every month you'll be looking at your ranking in certain categories, you'll be looking at which competitors are rising, which ones are declining, what kind of assortment is moving, what price changes are happening, what is the market size, blah blah blah. And we were just not, in our consulting context, we would go and try and buy that from market research providers, right? And we just couldn't find anything that we thought was granular or accurate enough. So we thought the e-commerce is now big enough that there should be this, so there should be a market. So perhaps the reason why it doesn't exist is because it can't be done. Maybe it's too difficult. So we started very small by trying to square out like one category on one platform in one market, and we were able to generate some good stuff there, and that's really what we formed the company around. So we are we're less than a year old. We are now present across Southeast Asia. We work with brands, institutional investors, consulting firms to give them clarity on their online selling environment. These brands tend to have great online, like good e-commerce analytics, attribution planning, like attribution for their modeling for their marketing spend, web analytics. They know themselves very well. We help them understand the landscape across Shopee, Lazada, TikTok Shop, Tokopedia, all these kinds of channels. And it's a very tough problem to crack because we hold a very high bar on accuracy and reliability. But we are taking it just one step at a time, and so far it's been really a wonderful ride. So we're about 18 people now on the team, including a wonderful data team, and producing market sizing, category sizing, competitive environment reports for these different kinds of customers.
Okay,
So
Bef-
that's what we do.
before I forget, where do people go to get access to everything that you do?
Yeah. Well, cube.asia is a good place to start, or search for me on LinkedIn. We have taken a growth approach, which is if we have 100 fuel units and we can spend them either on making the data good or making the delivery form amazing, like a beautiful UI or something like that, we're putting all the fuel units on the data. So right now, most of what we do is good old Excel sheets, which sometimes I think is a little bit. Some of the clients are a bit like, "Wait, what? Is that it?" But that is what we are focused on right now. We are launching a self-serve platform for all of the data subscriptions. Actually, I think next month. We've been working on that since January behind the scenes, but for now, I think an easy way to get in touch is either just our website or reach out to me anywhere, and I would love to discuss.
Okay, awesome. As I told you before, many of our listeners are, consumer brands considering expansion, really desiring and thirsty for expansion into the region. What would you say if you had a mid-sized American cosmetics brand
Yeah,
come to you for some advice on, hey, what is a basic blueprint for success in that region?
yeah. It's I think unfortunately it's not that easy. Because if we look at what is a brand, right? Like there are some formulations, there is a cost of goods which informs the price point, and then there's some branding around it. And it's a crowded market already. There are good formulations at good quality on basically all price points in all categories. Um, some brands are big enough that they come with some brand recognition already. Those can then leverage that latent knowledge, latent awareness to break into the market. But for any brands that are sort of below that bar, I think Southeast Asia can be a wonderful market if the price point is right. So I would say masstige is where you want to play. And then you should assume that you're rebuilding your brand entirely, which you can do through
Hmm.
influencer engagements. There is a pretty good playbook for how to do that. Um, but I've seen many instances of Western brands that come into Southeast Asia almost feeling, all right, now I will give you my amazing brand. I can't, now I will allow you to buy it from me. And then they look at their sales and they go, why is nobody buying my stuff, right? Um, but I think the price point has to be right. The brand has to be rebuilt unless it's already very big. Um, so I would say it can be a wonderful market, but you wanna really manage your expectations and think about it for the long term. Like just the population size of these markets mean that the the opportunities are so great, but most of the dollars are going to be in 5 or 10 years. So
Yeah.
it's I think it comes down to what is the right moment. If you already have some pull from the market, so if for whatever reason consumers are already aware of your brand, go now and leverage that. But if you're starting from a position where it's like, I want to sell there, the market doesn't really necessarily want me to sell there, I think it's just it can be a great adventure, but it should be like just go into it with open eyes.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about it on the podcast before about, having to rebuild your brand. I
Yeah,
don't want to scare anybody off. It's like having that third and fourth kid. Okay. I mean, no, you're better at it. You know what's going on. Yeah, they're still a baby. You still have to do all the stuff that drove you nuts when you had the first kid and the second kid, but you will be a better parent and you will have some efficiencies and some learned skills. So it is not replicating all the costs of building your
true.
brand, but you will actually have to build a new brand, another brand. It just won't be as hard or as costly as the first time. There will be hand me downs that you will be able to use. Okay. Simon Torring, co-founder of Cube Asia. If you're looking for amazing Southeast market insights and data and you want the steak without all the sizzle, he's the guy to go talk to, and Cube.Asia is the place you want to go. Simon, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Ted.
All right. For everybody listening to us on the podcast, don't forget we have the YouTube and the shorts going on at WPIC.co's YouTube channel. For those of you watching us on the video, you can get us audio only on all your podcast platforms, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. But for me and everybody at The Negotiation, and for Simon, thanks very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.